Make it screen bigger.
Okay, well, the thing is that the mouse, as soon as I take it off the screen, it goes there.
Oh,
and
okay.
then you can control with right and left,
So how do I change slides to the next one?
right and left.
Cool. All right.
Thank you. Thank
Yep.
you very much, Mark. Take it
Okay.
away.
Okay, as Dimitri said, my name is Mark Johns. I'm actually a geological oceanographer. I studied at the University of Washington and then at Texas A&M. And so I've done a lot of work on the glacial geology of Washington State in my practice and in my consulting career. I've been doing this for about 35 years now. So just to get a little background. So what are landslides? I'll go through a couple of things. I've got this segmented into different modules. So I talk about landslides and how they occur, what you can do, a little overview, then a kind of a geologic background of the regional geology here. And then a little bit about landslide history in the area, and then go right into the OSO investigation, how that kind of fits into everything. So landslides. This is a picture of the OSO landslide after it occurred in March of 2014, but landslides are typically, you can see on the right-hand side, you have rotational landslides, which are the whole wall comes down, which this landslide had. And you can see that by the large headscarp, the white area up to the tall, that's the rotational portion of the landslide. And then lower end, you had a debris flow. The debris flow is this area out here at the foot of the landslide. So you had two different kinds of landslides in this case. Yeah, you can quite see these guys. Let's see. This over, whoops. So this is the kind of a outlay of landslides and what happens. And you see a lot of cracking and downfalling. This isn't exactly as we see here in the first picture here of how it occurs and what happens. And you'll see a lot of slumping and folding. And in this case, when the OSO landslide happened, all the trees fell in one direction. They actually tipped and fell, pointed in one direction, which was towards the 530 road, which is right out here by the toe. Kind of a little bit about mechanics, what happens. A lot of times here, I'll go into the geology a little bit later, but you see a lot of seeps and springs cause landslides. That was part of the question I was supposed to answer. Take a look at that. You have mud flows in the lower left. You have slumps and slides. The OSO landslide was post several landslides in the region. I'll go through those and kind of give you an idea of what led up to OSO. And here's the triggering mechanisms for landslides, and it's a lot of water is a lot of the cause here in Washington State. And what you see in landslides is you see cracking. So those cracks are direct infiltration points to a fault plane that can help overweight debris and help further cause sliding. A couple other mechanisms you can see are removal of trees and vegetation. That occurs a lot around here. People like their views and they cut trees down, very dangerous. And then on the toe and the head of the slope, on the head of the slope up on top, you can have overweighting by putting buildings or construction sites on top of landslides that can cause problems. And then, as we were talking, Scott, the toe of the landslide often is a problem, where the removal of the toe or erosion of the toe of the landslide can further cause the slumping and sliding and activation of the slide planes, shear planes. So where's OSO? I don't know how many of you know where OSO is, but it's just north of Seattle here. You go up to Arlington, take a right, head towards Darrington, which is out at the foot of Glacier Peak and Snow King Mountain and a lot of high peaks in the Central Cascades. OSO is about halfway out. It kind of occurs at a point where you're in the convergence zone here out of the Straits of Juan de Fuca. So the weather funnels into this area quite heavily. And it starts out by Arlington as being a wide valley and narrows to its narrowest point at OSO. And then expands again towards Glacier Peak right behind it to the east. So keep that in mind. It's all constricted by mountains, very sharp little valley. Landslide hazards in Washington State, very interesting. You see these different regions up in the Olympics. You got the Puget Sound lowland, which is where we live right now. You got the Cascade Mountain ranges, but on the right here, we see existing landslides at the time of 2014 and how they occur and where they occur. So it really shows up that predominantly along the west slope of the Cascades and in the mountain ranges where you have high valleys, a lot of water flow, steep terrain. A little overview here. I got involved in about July of 2014. The landslide occurred in March 22nd. It was just, it's the most severe landslide in US history with 43 people lost their lives. A really tragic event. And it completely inundated the community. So as we're talking, all of the homes were destroyed, except for a couple remained to the east side of the slide. The slide missed them. But then as the slide dammed the river, they all flooded. The original reconnaissance was by the GEAR team, which is Geologic Engineering Response Team. Fast acting team that goes and says, what happened? Let's go look for survivors. How can we determine this landslide? And kind of, they gather a lot of information very quickly and look at what they can think of and predict in the future for landslides. I was involved with Grandy Lakes, which was a forest properties owner up on the top of the plateau, and they actually did some timber cutting that was proposed to have caused added infiltration that might have triggered the slide. And the state of Washington was also involved. They were the two defendants. The state of Washington was involved for actually the roads and some of the work they had done up there, and also the permitting for forest practices on top of the platform. I'll show you that this was a big high plateau, and there was a very big headscarp on the face that you saw in the photograph before. Okay, we talk a little bit about what was going on before. So in the early years, there was a couple of landslides out there that Shannon and Wilson did some evaluation of 1950s. The first landslide and documented in newspapers was about 1913, when a portion of this area took out a railroad. Railroad had to be rebuilt. So that was the earliest documentation we found. What everybody thought was a potential unconfined aquifer perched on the Till. The Till is a regional formation around here that was caused by overconsolidation from very heavy glaciers. And in the Till in this area, I sampled many times, and it was almost like, if I took my rock hammer, it was almost like hitting cement. It was that hard, very impermeable. And so a lot of what happens here is you have a big sand pile on top of Till, and water that infiltrates through comes down, hits the Till, and then runs off. So I looked at that throughout the region very specifically. And as I said, the GEAR team was here, and when they got out there, essentially a day or two afterwards, they found seeps all over the place. And so this, as the slump happened, it began dewatering immediately. It was kind of dangerous. When I was up there in June, it was dangerous still. So was this enough? No. From the history, we knew we had to go out and look at the specific geology in this area and see what was happening. So part of the study I did was to install a bunch of groundwater wells on top of the plateau and a bunch in the slide itself. So we did that. The state of Washington facilitated that. They had the drill teams. They have all the equipment for all their road work, et cetera. So they actually implemented it. So GEAR collected a lot of information. They looked at the vegetation, they looked at the strata, the morphology of the area, characterized what was in the landslide, the materials that were in the landslide, and then looked at the mechanism of movement and direction. Of course, the direction was north to south. It occurred straight across the valley floor. It actually ran out a kilometer or two across 530 highway, hit the wall in the south, splashed off, and came back on itself. And then they looked at impacted structures, and as I mentioned, they were almost always completely destroyed. I'll give you a little bit of geologic background here. So we have physiographic regions in our provinces in this area, Puget Sound lowland. And this is all glacially driven. So the glaciers played a huge part of the deposition in our area here. And they carved out these provinces. So you had glaciers coming down from north to south through the Puget lowland, the predominant glacier, but then you also had alpine glaciers coming off the Cascades and off the Olympics. So it's kind of complex. And Oso, as I mentioned, was right in the finest point there, or the narrowest point of that valley. And it was influenced, the geology of the area was influenced by the glaciers from off of Glacier Peak and Snow King Mountain, which are just to the east. So you had a combination of continental and alpine glaciation. The big lobe came down and started receding at about 12,000, 15,000 years ago. So as we sit right here, 20,000 years ago, there was 2 kilometers of ice above us. So it's a big lobe. So as the glaciers retreated, they actually came down in waves, retreated a little bit, came up with the last retreat. They left the recessional outwash. So as the glaciers retreated, they dropped, as they melted, they dropped all the particles that they were holding and formed a recessional outwash on top of a till. And that till is the important layer I'm looking at here, but below that was an advanced outwash. So as they came down, they bulldozed gravel and piled up soils. And
How big was the recessional outwash again?
I'll show you a map of that. It's about, off the top of my head, I forget right now, but it's 130 feet, I think, in this area. I got some borings. But below that, as they dammed everything up, they formed inner valley lakes. And the lakes were fine sediments. And so on the bottom of all this, you had a clay. We talked about the historical landslides there. This is a LiDAR image of the Oso landslide, which is right middle here, red. This is the Oso landslide. Right next to it's a Rowan landslide that's 400 years old. Several others in the area are up to 6,000 years. On both sides of the valley, and as if you work your way up the valley, there's even more of these. This work was done by the University of Washington, a graduate student in their geomorphology section did this study. And immediately what we had here was what I eventually did was go up to the top of the bench, see this big flat area, slightly sloped east, and of course still going south. So some of the early landslides that occurred in the area were precipitated by the Stillaguamish River actually cutting into that hillside, cutting the toe of the material out and causing slides, but nothing this as large as what happened in 2014. So let's see, Holocene. Yep, it's all basically what happened in this area since the Holocene. So 6,000 years, everything was pushed up, settled in, and it started eroding. So 6,000 to 8,000 years, you started getting a lot of landslides. Started. Okay, the Oso. Oh, it's 1908 was the first newspaper article that the Hazel actually was blocking a railroad track. We looked at the 1952 Shannon work where they actually did a few borings, I think half a dozen, in an existing landslide there. And they were looking at seeps and flow, of course, the water flow to see what was causing the problem there. And one of their landslides was, okay, then 1967, I don't know if many of you recall, but the toe of the slope moved and dammed up the Stillaguamish River and actually flooded the whole area of the Stillaguamish housing development. And you would have thought at that time people would have kind of awakened to potential issues and said, geez, high tide at my house was, up to the front porch, the door. It was pretty devastating, but they rebuilt and they re-permitted and rebuilt in the area. And actually the Steelhead Haven housing development there was more houses put in. In 1988, a guy named Benda came in and was looking at groundwater and did some estimates of groundwater without putting any wells in for what was coming off the top of the slope. And that was the complication that actually got me hired to look at that, putting groundwater wells on top of the bench in order to really determine where the water was flowing and how it was flowing, the groundwater. These are just a couple of reports. Benda's model was on the right, and he postulated that water that fell on top of the Whitman bench was flowing directly to the south and out of the face of what became the slide. And he says the groundwater flow from top of the bench. Here, the slide is right here this way. Top of the bench is pretty flat, as you can see. So he postulated that water was coming right out of the face, causing this slumps. So you had toe erosion and water erosion, or water lifting essentially the slide. But he had, as I said, no groundwater wells at all. So here's the Hazel landslide. This is 2003. You can see clearly that there's a small scarp here. Later on, I'll show you that it goes all the way back to this top line. You kind of see the tree line here. So heavy trees on the top of the bench was forested heavily. This over here is a creek on the eastern side, Headache Creek. That happened in 2003. This happened in 2003. This post that shot. You can see this is really heavily. This is big trees. Climb over them, they're all. And this occurred in the river. And you can actually see here that the river's acted by the clays that were there. So it was actually muddied up quite a bit. That becomes important because the North Fork of the Stillaguamish River is a steelhead, it's Salmon River. And the tribe was very interested in stopping that impact from the silting of the river because it was damaging the steelhead runs, salmon runs. So they actually built a revetment in this area to hold back any further slumping. And they actually built it right about here, and it actually filled in and kind of created a little pond behind this, but it did stop the siltation of the river. Let's see. Okay, in January 2006, this is the one that flooded the town. This slide, that's what I see for me. This slide moved up the hill a ways. You can clearly see. You could see the trees laid down. Down the slide. They rotated over, they tipped and fell south. You can see it impacted and moved the river. At this point, they said we need to hold this back. But this is the one that actually cut the river off, back flooded the Steelhead Haven community, and then cut its way through again. And that occurred fairly quickly when it cut its way through.
So this one didn't do any direct damage to the community.
It flooded the community,
Just
just lifted the water up, so it blocked the river, created a little lake behind it that flowed into Steelhead Village. And then eventually the river cut itself through and then reflowed, the floods receded. Okay. And in that time, they installed the log revetment. And you can see from this photograph, right along riverbed with these two arrows inside, annotated photo. But this is the log revetment. It was post-piled tree timbers that log. And it was an attempt to keep the silt out of the river. And you can see here it forms a pond. So it was like a dam. Structurally, it wasn't the best. It ultimately failed it. Between 2006 and before 2014, it was failing. So here's, on the left is a LiDAR image of the Oso landslide. after March 2014, and on the right is a picture. And you can clearly see the portions of the landslide. The green area was the failure of the base. I'm going to tell you later that that actually occurred second. The first failure was a debris flow, which is the blue, the red, and the yellow, which is out in front of the slide. And you can see that it slid from north to south across the valley. It actually hit a pretty steep wall of similar material on the far side. And actually there were splash marks up the wall. You could see how far it went. And then kind of spilled out east and west in the valley floor. That closed Highway 530 for a long time, created a lot of havoc in the area. People couldn't get out of Darrington that area for a long time. But the picture on the right clearly shows the different sections. In the slump, the upper slump actually just dropped like 300 feet about. The face is about 600 feet tall from the river elevation to the top of the bench. So it fell halfway. The community was right. There was a couple of houses that were spared being torn apart over here. There was one house right here that I gained access for a road here to this part of the slide. This was very liquid material and it was very steep and hummocky underneath. This is a vertical face. It's not vertical, but almost vertical. But the first slide actually ran through the community, and there were survivors, and they described it, and that was in the newspapers as a thundering noise, and it was only a couple of minutes long. When the second one hit, and the second one the rotational slump hit the materials below it, it actually caused further movement of the front materials. And just to give you an idea of what it looks like, I've got some pictures here. I hiked the whole area several times. The debris flow pushed buildings out to the front. They sort of floated off. The picture on the left is the scarp later on, because you could see that it continued to erode. This was vertical and it continued to erode and form these piling up of materials, coarse materials, cobbles, boulders, bowling ball size to sand size. And it's actually regrading a little bit now to this day. One of the original shots, the lower right, shows you can see the till there, and I'll show you the line, but you can see that dark line, that's the top of the till. And off to the right and left, it varied a little bit. Yeah, right here you see line right here. That gray line, that's the top of the till. It's actually sitting almost horizontal at this point, but it's the material above eroding and forming shallow, it's covering the till. This occurred after the landslide. This is the recession wash, kind of brown. So it's more oxidized, recent. It's about 130 feet. It's degrading backwards. It's dropping boulders across. Till doesn't grow very well. So and that comes all the way out to here. This area over here is another creek, Heading Creek, which when you look at landslides there, they were about 500 years old. And so I went up on top of this here and drilled a bunch of wells. And then there was a bunch of wells drilled in this material.
So the one on the bottom is the advancing outwash.
Yes, you
Okay,
can't,
yeah.
you can't quite see it from either photograph, but it's both covered by this material right here. In that photo. This is what it looks like on the slide. Well, it looked like on the slide. And you can see the rotational block that just slumped down and sat, and the trees were laid over horizontally there. Below that was the rotational slide, or the debris flow, I'm sorry, to the left, the rotational slide to the right. And then you can see in the lower left that it blocked the river and flooded the valley. Then the river eventually cut through. It reached a point where it flowed near its original course, but it had all been moved to the south. The left view is looking upriver. So your back's to the west and you're looking east. And you can see how the river cut through this area. And it's causing further movement of the debris materials that were in the area. The top left shows kind of the area that was turned into it's now a marsh still. It was a lake at one point. And then the lower right is looking from east to west, east to northwest, towards the slide, from the upper valley to the slide. This is what the debris portion of the far material that flowed all the way to the south, and the road you see here on the left is the 530 highway after it was cleaned up. So after it was reopened. And of course, there's a memorial there. You can pull in and see what I just showed you. The investigation we did. Okay, let's do that. The gear investigation looked at all the different parts of the landslide to see what caused the problem or what caused the damage. The upper portion was the headscarp. There was a back rotated block that I said just slipped down. The middle area was there were lateral debris flows left and right. And then there was just all these mixed sediments from the lacustrine or lake deposits that pushed out towards 530. So they studied the slide really quickly. And then if you look at to the right side there, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a creek called Headache Creek that flows into Rollins Creek. And Headache Creek, I did several tours of the area, hiking all around. This creek became very important. Rollins Creek goes all the way up to Skagit County. So I hiked all of Rollins Creek and the backside of the slide to specifically look at Headache Creek. Headache Creek is formed from seeps off the Whitman Bench. And as I said, it was kind of tipped to the north a little bit, so you'd expect surface water flow off that way. Although most of the surface water infiltrates because it's very coarse materials. Forested, but coarse. So what doesn't get used by the forest that does hit the surface and infiltrates ultimately flowed off to Headache Creek. I'll show you how I know that. Let's see. So the guys I worked for were the forest Grandy Lakes, and they cut this small area on top of the hill. And there was a lot of confusion in the trial, or the trial got settled, but a lot of confusion pre-trial about whether or not they were within their boundaries. But essentially there was just a little piece that might have been outside their boundaries, but they also we did a lot of rainfall surveys up there for a year and a half, 2 years, and looked at rainfall in the forested canopy, rainfall in the floor of this area, and how it was infiltrating or how it was collecting and how much vegetation was taking off. And, it was about 30%, 40% vegetation use, and then the rest was infiltrated. So there is water infiltrating there. And becomes the question is, where's the water flowing that does infiltrate? Is it flowing out the face of the slide or somewhere else? So there's been a lot of harvest up there. And if you look at, it's about 1,200 acres on top of the bench. It's been harvested. There was patchwork harvesting at different times, much bigger than this 8-acre piece. And that occurred, I think 6 or 7 years before 2014, so before the slide. So it was growing back. So we looked at the geology, of course, it's, glacial. We looked at seismic because it's right on a fault. There's a fault runs along the range that's right behind to the north of the Oso landslide. So we had to look at seismic activity because that could be a trigger. We looked at forest harvesting on the Whitman Bench from the 20s forward. I looked at historical precipitation and then precipitation studies that occurred in 2016, 15. So we looked at all these different components that could contribute to the slide or the implementation of the sliding. Here's a LiDAR image from 2003 of the Whitman Bench, which is 1,146 acres, and all of the drainages around it. So the predominant drainage is, of course, North Fork of the Stillaguamish River, which is to the south, but there's a tremendous amount of drainage all around this, and the mountains right behind go up to about 6,000, 7,000 feet, right behind it, very steep. They're Eocene bedrock. And here, I'll go back once. You notice that scarp was there, just not as predominant. So it was all tree covered. So you just didn't quite see it, but LiDAR sees right through that. And here again, you can see all the slides in the area. The big one to the left is the Rowan, which occurred about 500 years ago, a huge slide. And it's regressing into the Whitman Bench also. And I drove and hiked all of that. It's very similar features. Here you see what in 2003, we were lucky up here. We had LiDAR data from a couple of years, not all the best, but we did luck out and have some. And you can see there's different scarps from the 2003 Hazel landslide, 2006 landslide, and some of the old riverbed, the confluence of Headache Creek. Headache Creek runs north to south and then cuts down to Rollins Creek to the east. And then it toes into the Rowan slide, actually. So part of the thing I'll show you later is that this lower head scarp, that was the first failure in this event. And then here's 2014 with underlying the other 2003 LiDAR. But you can see how the river got completely pushed back. And here's all the descriptive members of the geology formation. So the recessional outwash was on top of the till, which is very hard. And then the outwash slough was the recessional outwash eroding off onto the lower portions. And then all the displaced materials. Here's the aerial photograph Google shot out of all the wells we put in. And you can clearly see the pie-shaped forest if it was deforested. And then all the wells. The wells to the right are right at the headscarp of the Headache Creek side. And so I designed this to see if water was flowing north to south or to the east. So we had 8 borings up there, 12 additional ones on the slide. And over a year and a half, about half of the ones on the slide had failed because the slide was still slightly moving. So we had vibrating wireline piezometers, which allow us to measure the water table via in-well logging, and we could just download that and had very good groundwater data for this whole area. And then this is a picture of what we finally found, the elevations. So the outwash was about 900 feet, top of it roughly. The till was another, just, not that much. Look at it, it's 190 feet of till, very hard, dense concrete. Then you had siltified sand underneath that, which is against outwash, overlaid by silty clay. Now you're down to the valley floor, which was very fine grained silts. The Olympiad Formation It turns out that the Olympia Formation, people in Steelhead Haven had complained that their wells were actually flooding themselves or they were free flowing. They would flow out of the well caps. So the Olympia Formation was overpressured. And that's at the base of everything. Which,
So there was groundwater flow upwards.
yes. They're artesian wells. And I actually measured one, when I said I came into the very western side, the home there had an artesian well flowing when I was there visiting. Actually,
It was already at elevation. There was still water coming in.
water flowing up. So we had artesian conditions. You've got all these glacial materials. Where is the upper water flowing? Is it flowing out of the face or is it flowing towards Headache Creek? So all the well data, we had well data for over a year and a half-ish on top of the Whitman platform, and it was clearly showing that Headache Creek or the water that was infiltrating the groundwater was flowing towards Headache Creek. And there's a couple of things that I find when I was hiking this whole area. One, you can see how smooth this is. You see how cat clawed this is. So I went up here and looked, and there was a couple of seeps on this. There's one up here. And on this, every one of these valleys is a seep. So the water, I saw the water flowing into Headache Creek, and then the wells confirmed that that was the groundwater direction. And the two slumps in Headache Creek, which I showed you earlier, the guy named Luhusen at University of Washington found, they were, I think, 500 years old. So that had slumped twice. So the direction wasn't out towards the Oso landslide. So what was the cause, right? And here we're looking at, we did precipitation rainfall. I mentioned that. Very high rainfall in the 2014 March period, like 20 inches of rain in the convergence zone. So it was one of the largest, highest rainfall periods on record. We actually looked at the Darrington Ranger Station rainfall records, which were all manual over like 50 years. That was pretty cool.
Which month did the landslide?
March. Yeah, so there was, the thought process by most people was that the high rainfall and flow at the face caused the slumping. We did a very detailed preceding rainfall and post precipitation analysis. And we saw that the Clearclad had, 15 to 20% through fall, meaning through the trees. And it, it was essentially the same in 9 year and 27 year. These were different cuts in that area. So we looked at forest cuts versus rainfall versus infiltration. Let's see. I don't believe I presented. Oh, yeah. So let's see what this is. Oh, that's good. So here's a LiDAR with kind of a elevation map color coded on top of it. And you can see that the purple red are the higher elevations. And so Whitman Bench slightly sloped towards Headache Creek, which is the running northwest, southeast side of it. And you can see the gully is clearly in this LiDAR view. The yellow outline was where Grandy Lakes did the harvest. And then the slide is to the southeast. So the slope putting away, the groundwater flow shows that groundwater is moving towards Headache Creek. Then dumps into Rollins Creek and then dumps into the North Fork really close. Yeah, as I mentioned before, here's a kind of a forest map. We looked at all the different clear cuts in the area over, 110 years or 100 years of forestry. Then again, we looked at the slide and slumping and the stability of the slope. Part of my team was a geological engineer and a geotechnical engineer. So we looked at the slumping and sliding and what happened here. And these are all the different layers. The slide event in 2003 was directly related to water in the landslide mass. So what happened is it overloaded with water and slumped again. The 2006 happened because the toe of the slope was eroded, cut away, and it failed. dammed the river, and then flooded the village or the Steelhead Haven. So it's interesting that the Hazel landslide didn't trigger the 2014 event here, we decided. And that the 2014 debris flow was related to precipitation and groundwater. So what happened was it got overloaded. It's a hummocky, cracked feature. It got overloaded. It's debris flowing, liquefied, and just ran. And as it ran across the river, it picked up more water and kind of lubricated the surface. So it had this long run out. But then the earth slide was the head wall failure. Once that lower portion was gone, the upper portion couldn't sustain. And about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes later, I'll show you this. About 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, the head wall failed. And this is not a seismic event. This is the landslide seismicity that was measured at 3 or 4 different seismometers that are located around here. The farthest one was 20 kilometers and one was 10 kilometers away. So you actually see the event occurring. The first, as you go from left to right, and as it spreads out, what you see is this rotational slump happened, occurred over a period of a minute or two, and then stopped. So it ran out across the valley floor in a minute. We know how far it went. We know how long it occurred. Then there was this period of quiet for like, I think it's 200 seconds, 3 minutes. And boom, the top falls. And then overpressured that rotational material and pushed it out farther. So you see it tails off a little bit more. It's really, I looked at it yesterday. I forgot, but I think, so this is at, and now this is seconds on the bottom. This is at about 60 seconds. This is 200. So that's 140 seconds of this first event. About 2 minutes plus 2 minutes. Then right about here, it's about 200. This is about 350. So another 3 minutes. And then this trails off, and you see this decreases slower. So that was just the landslide.
Earth slide. It occurred down in the South Washington, so cut through the tail.
Yes. Yeah. The earth slide. So when you move the rotational slide moved away, which was the old Hazel overloaded, it crept up the hill further, pulled materials down into the advanced outwash. And as we know that because we hiked all around the area until we could see where everything was located. The trees were very beneficial because what happened was that kind of undermined the upper slope. And then it just 2 minutes later, it just failed. And that failure occurred from a new rotational plane through the recessional outwash, through the till, through the advanced into that silty layer below. So it failed through the silty layer.
Talk about the sessional at wells not wash.
Yes, we did. Those were the ones on the, we actually went all the way through to the advanced. I don't have the borings with me, but the upper ones we took all the way through. We took one through all the way to the bottom. We put nested piezometers in it. So the whole profile was measured for groundwater. Yes. And then in the Olympia, which I said was overpressured. So I didn't bring those here today. Did I? No, I didn't bring the, see, no, I didn't bring that. But I have all the wells mapped, continuously. And so we did.
Advanced outwash saturated or saturated zone. Saturated.
It was saturated. The recessional was partially saturated, with vadosone. The till was dry. The advanced was up to the top. Almost, yeah. And then the Olympia was overpressured. So very complex slide mechanism.
And there was definitely no seismic activity that.
Yeah, we counted that out, looked at the seismicity.
We're still there as well.
Yeah. What's the Devil's Fault? It's called Devil's Fault. It runs along the face of the mountains right behind it. right almost through the site. Right, it runs right up Rollins Creek. So that's how that formed. Yes. Yeah. So some of that flowed into the Hazel, and then we figured we felt that the Hazel was so hummocky and cracked that it just overloaded with the 20 inches of rainfall that occurred. And when you do that, we did the calculations, and it's a huge number. It's a huge weight. It's a large volume. Of course, you're guesstimating a lot of things, but you know, the Hazel landslide was pretty big footprint, but it didn't. It moved into the river. The Hazel in the 2006, I should say, moved into the river, but not across it. And they weren't enough to trigger the upper headwall fault. So it's a pretty complex mechanism to move enough weight off the toe to cause that headwall just to drop. And it hung for 2 minutes, which was when we looked at the seismic, we were like, wow. And that was completely corroborated by eyewitnesses. So that was, we felt we kind of really understood the area after that.
Really. River cut into the Hazel.
Yeah. And that was, if you look, remember my first thing, that was the building on top of the hill and the infiltration. Essentially, it just overweighted itself and then just prepped it. And as soon as it failed, it was in the river. And so it floated. It took on more water because of that. It just ran across the valley floor. And with the drilling through that, it's pretty amazing. I mean, you put your finger on it. It's a very small shear plane. And we actually went into we've got a bunch more photographs on the east side of the failure. The Olympia outcrops in the edge of Rollins Creek, and it's a clay at the top, and it's just a pure slick layer. But what happens is all this material was, as it was receded, the material got dropped and a lake was forming as the glacier was receding. And as soon as the glacier was gone, it turned into this North Fork of the Still-Gawmish River, and it started pushing material out to the Puget Sound, cut its way through, and it did this all through the valley. And then it comes to this constriction where there's the hard bedrock at Oso, and did this. And so it moved across valleys many times there because of, historically many times since 15,000 years ago, because of the amount of material that got clogged up in that area. And one of the LiDARs, you could see the various riverbeds slightly. When was it? There, this one. You can see the river formations. The LiDAR is amazing. I mean, you can see all these little perturbations in the river here, one time. Then, you know, the outcome of this was something that Washington State picked up very quickly. Let's see. Oh, the boring went. We did. Let's see, where are we? So here, this gives. Yeah, so the top's about 900 feet, and we went to 242 feet. So we had one that was 500 feet.
What you're talking about, you could have with you just be a second.
Yeah, then what we did was we dropped a bunch of wells at the top of the hill. And then we drilled one down through the whole thing. Because we knew the till it's 120 feet of basically impermeable material. And it underlies the whole area of the top of the ditch. So we didn't need to really drill it all the way through in a lot of places. That 500-foot well failed. It's very hard because it's, you know, you got cobbles and boulders up there. So we had to step off and drill another one right below it and right beside it. So we just did the majority of them, 6 or 7 of the 8 were only into the till. That's how we were able to just look at the groundwater and say, well, okay, we really know where the groundwater is flowing now. we've got seeps at Headache Creek, we've got groundwater flow. Over multiple periods of time, you know, year and a half, enough seasonality to say it's occurring all the time. But I was not gonna get to here. Where am I? Okay, oh, sorry. So what this did was it really increased the landslide awareness in the state of Washington. Now they're LiDARing every valley. They're putting this into the permitting systems for homes in, you know, Washington State. This is a map of what was done before and after LiDAR. So they've been continuously mapping the state since then. You guys might have heard of the school landslide right over here that took out the house.
Yes, yeah, recently, yes.
Same material, only it was a pipe. It was a pipe that came across underneath the hill and then went down the hill. It failed. So it overwatered the hillside. But same kind of materials right around here. Anyway,
What was the results of the, like, since it rarely has anything to do with
Yeah.
science, what was the result yesterday?
43 deaths, right? It was tragic event. State settled for 50 million because they had their experts. And I go into this when I give a talk to the environmental scientists. Their experts kind of did some bad things in the sense that they discussed what data they wanted to present and what data they didn't want to present. And there was a motion against them. There was sanctions against them to basically say, the judge was going to say, I read the thing 5 times. The judge was going to say, be careful with what this person says. This is what they said in the field. So the state settled for, I think, 50 million. And Grandy Lakes insurance settled for, I think, about 10. So on the day of the trial. So that was the outcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. Excellent, excellent presentation. Do we have any questions from the people here in the room here? You guys have any questions? I think we got our questions answered firsthand here. Anybody from the audience, from the online audience, have any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for everyone for attending. We really wish you were here. We over provisioned the food for this meeting, but yeah, thank you for attending, and I hope you have.
Well, one of these or this one. Yes, this is the pre-2014 slide. So this geology is the same. They're talking about this one. Or this one. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is the post or the 2014.
Yeah, that's,
So the
that's, sorry,
recording-
that was the one I was hoping to see again. Thank you.
This one, okay.
Yeah, so the other one showed, this one showed the Hazel in the 2006 landslide. And this one shows the 2014 landslide.
And the recording is going to be on YouTube, so you can see all the slides that were presented. You can see them there and pause and have a look. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Take care. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.